a non-event and pretty straightforward. On the other side of it, it might be a little confusing, so I thought it might be a good idea that come up and walk you through it. As everyone knows, we've approved, by virtue of resolutions of the authority and the city, the community center transaction over a year ago. It seems like it was in I've gotten in maybe September or so of October of last year, and had been going through that process with rural development to get the city in a position, or the authority, where you could close that financing. We received information last week from rural development that they had some concerns relative to the terms of the underlying lease agreement whereby the property was leased from the A&M Board of Regents to the local Board of Regents and ultimately to the city. And talking with council for rural development, the issue was more a function of how do their regulations interface with the terms of that lease. And we pretty quickly got to the point of, or at least I got to the point pretty quickly, that I'm not sure that there's any way to satisfy the regulations as they're written and as they were being interpreted with the terms of that lease without a significant rewrite of that lease from the A&M Board of Regents. And my concern was furthered by the fact that at least one of the things they wanted changed is not something that I think we would have gotten from the A&M Board of Regents. Essentially, their regs required if they ever had to foreclose that facility, they could take that facility and use it for whatever they wanted to during the foreclosure. And that's really not, I think, what the A&M Regents had in mind when they long-term leased that property for use as a college campus and as a community center. So based upon that, I'm just giving you some quick background, I just kind of backed up and said, we need to think about this a different way. And what would you think of changing the security, essentially taking away your mortgage? You say, that's not my call, that's a national office call in D.C. So I started working with Doug and with the state office and put together a memo basically proposing a different security structure and sent that off to the national office and literally sent it off at 9:30 one night, and we got an answer the next morning. They were fine with it. So, which is pretty unheard of in federal government time. But, here's the kind of long and short where we ended up. All right, the city was agreeing under the old structure to give a mortgage on their leasehold interest, and they were also agreeing to make a lease payment subject to year-to-year appropriation out of just city revenues to make a payment that would satisfy the debt service on the rural development loan and on the equally secured bank loan, the Stock Exchange Bank. And we got them to release the requirement of having a mortgage, and instead of just making a unencumbered lease payment, we said, what if we pledge you some sales tax, also subject to year-to-year appropriation? So what we negotiated is 0.25% sales tax being pledged for the first 10 years. Then when the bank loan pays off after 10 years, that sales tax pledge drops it down to an 8 or 0.125% for the remaining term of the loan, no mortgage. We drafted all the documents last week, sent those off for review, actually sent them Saturday. Got pretty good indication today that their lawyers accept those documents as written. We haven't gotten that 100%, but I think that's where we're going to be by this time tomorrow. So good news is we've worked through a problem that I wasn't sure we were going to work through and did it in pretty short order. If we can get the financing closed before the end of the year, another bonus is that rural development obligated their funds at a rate that was going to be the lesser of 4.375% or whatever the rate was in the calendar quarter we closed. Well, that rate for this calendar quarter has dropped down to 3.75%. So that 40-year interest rate, if we close this calendar quarter, we're going to get that lower interest rate. If it slips in the next quarter, we might still, I mean, they reset that rate every quarter, and it really has no relationship to what the markets are doing generally. But we've got a lower interest rate now than we did when the funds were committed to us. So I'm hopeful, subject to your approval this evening, that we'll get a closing schedule and get this deal wrapped up this calendar year. That was a long, that was about 3 times more than I normally would say. So, but I felt like you needed the background, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. The resolution is in very much the same format you've seen in the past. The reason we're having to reapprove it is because the securities change. And there's a reference in the resolution to the year-to-year pledge of sales tax versus the mortgage and the lease payments. So that's the reason that we felt the need to come back before you and clean that piece of it up. But the transaction is to a very great extent the same transaction.
Alan, you might also explain the change in lease agreement, the direction, these change directions, and also I want you to also advise the council on the option to waive the competitive bidding.
Perfect. We contemplated a lease agreement previously, really a leaseback, where the leasehold interest is currently in the city's name. All right, and because we were going to, in the prior structure, have a lease payment from the city to the authority, we had to take that leasehold interest, lease it to the authority, and then lease it back to the city in exchange for the lease payment. Okay? Now we're simply talking about a lease from the city to the authority to get operational maintenance control over the authority's name, which is one of rural development's requirements. They want the authority, as the borrower, be the entity responsible for operations. So that I think covers that change. In terms of competitive bidding, relative to the sale of the obligation, under Title 60, the Public Trust Act, when we're selling an obligation to a state or federal entity, we don't have to, competitive bidding doesn't apply, all right? For example, on loans we've had with the Oklahoma Water Resources Board, that wasn't an issue. With federal government, same circumstance. We do have to waive competitive bidding relative to the bank financing, all right? And we've talked about this on all of the transactions we've done in the past. Competitive bidding is a requirement per statute that you have to put a public notice in the paper, go through certain steps before you can sell an obligation. In my 25 plus years of doing this, I've never done that. In other words, you always waive competitive bidding, even though in the circumstance we have here relative to the bank loan, we went through a competitive process, just like on the Crystal Beach financing. Each time we would kind of work through a process. But again, here you went through a competitive process. You received 3 bids, as I recall, for the sale of this obligation. The low bid was from Stock Exchange Bank. All of the bids were based upon an interest rate or a percentage over prime. Stock Exchange bid 50 basis points over prime, with prime to be measured 10 days prior to the financing closing. So the other bids that were received were from Bank 7
and
CNB. And those bids were a significantly larger spread over prime than the Stock Exchange bid was. So, but that was the process we went through. So you're being asked to waive competitive bidding. From a purely legal standpoint, you don't have to take bids at all if you do that, or you don't have to go through any kind of competitive process at all. That's optional to the authority, but you did do that in this circumstance. But regardless, you have to waive competitive bidding on the transaction.
On that 0.25% sales tax, it won't fluctuate. Will our payment fluctuate with 1/4 to an 8%?
The payments are going to be fixed once we close. Okay.
What if our 1/4 sales tax doesn't reach that?
Well, this is what it's kind of a term of art. I say term of art. It's referred to as a moral obligation. All right. The practical side of it is the city has to appropriate that sales tax each year. just like again on your other pure sales tax back transaction, we have one in favor of MidFirst right now where we refinance the hospital debt. The Crystal Beach financings are all solely secured by sales tax. One, the city could decide next year on any of those transactions simply not appropriate the sales tax, and there's not anything that the holder of the debt could do. The reason that lenders are comfortable with that security is they know that you can only fail to appropriate once. And I mean, the theory is you're out of luck in terms of borrowing money going forward. So communities realize the need to protect that reputation and stick to their moral obligation to appropriate the tax. The reality is that if your sales tax collections dip down, I have every confidence that the city of Woodward would, come up with whatever revenues are necessary outside that sales tax pledge to make sure they made their debt service payment. But we've essentially pledged enough sales tax to cover debt service, all right, as well as pay an estimated operational cost or operational amount to operate the facilities. But that was, again, kind of an estimate, a pretty early estimate, and an amount sufficient to build up a debt reserve account, which is required under the rural development financing that you build up over 10 years to an amount equal to essentially 1 year's debt service payment. So that's the idea, though, is that we have an amount pledged that based upon your collections as of June 30 of last year, okay, or the fiscal year ending June 30, 2010, which was, I guess, your lowest in the last 5 years. We based that assumption on the collections for that year, and we've also based it on the assumption that you're going to have no growth in that sales tax over the next 40 years, which we all assume is not going to work out that way. So if anything, you're going to have a little more sales tax over time as that sales tax grows, all right, than what you would need to pay your obligation. Bank loan pays off in 10 years. If in years, those last 30 years, if you decided that you had too much sales tax tied up, you could go back and ask for a release of some of that security. The other option we have with rural development financing is you can pay it off at any point in time. So I think you have some flexibility there in terms of how much you have tied up. But the real base answer to your question is, regardless of what happens to your sales tax, the assumption is that the city will appropriate sufficient monies to pay the debt.
You mentioned our other sales tax back repayments. Can we just kind of, in general, talk about what sales tax is spoken for, so to speak, kind of the structure right now, what all we have?
I think I can walk through that quickly. You've got a 2% general sales tax, all right? 1.5% of your 2% general is pledged to all of the Crystal Beach financings. And I think we have 4 financings outstanding, three financings that are equally secured by that 1.5% sales tax, okay? The quarter dropping to an 8 that's pledged on this is half to a fourth of the remaining half of that 2% general. Okay, so that's pledged to this transaction. The MidFirst transaction is secured by
the half penny.
No, it's a full penny.
I mean, full penny.
And that transaction pays off in 2 years.
Correct.
And so when that financing pays off, that penny will be freed up. That penny has it's essentially a capital improvement penny, and it has a stated term going out to
2032.
Thank you. And then you have a 0.5-cent sales tax that is not pledged to anything, that also has a stated term that is unencumbered right now.